Yeah, it was nice to sit with everybody and to see that more familiar faces have joined us. It's wonderful. So, what we're going to talk about tonight is entirely Lily's fault. She and I were having a conversation a number of weeks ago, and it inspired me to just ponder this particular topic, which I'm going to loosely orbit around defensiveness. Um, but I got a little bit curious about it, so I've been sitting with it for the last number of weeks. Uh, Many of you know and love Matthew Brensilver, and I certainly do. And he was on the 10% Happier podcast. It must be 4 or 5 years ago now. And he was asked this rather basic question: what is mindfulness? And we all know what our stock answer would be. And of course, Matthew Brensilver doesn't give stock answers to anything. And he said something along the lines of, mindfulness is being willing to die. And he kind of just like let it sit there for a moment in his typical provocative fashion. And of course went on to unpack it. And he wasn't saying that he wants to die, but he was describing this sense of perhaps what we might call defenselessness that can come with mindfulness. And it's useful to juxtapose that notion with the opposite of mindfulness, right? Mindlessness, right? Those moments of getting distracted. We can think of the ways the mind gets distracted in the present moment almost as a way often of trying to ensure that we're comfortable. It could be physical, like, oh, I need to adjust my posture, a certain way of trying to ensure that the present moment is comfortable and safe. And that a lot of the times when we slip into thoughts about the future, that too is often kind of has this tone of trying to keep the future comfortable and safe, whether that's the immediate future or if we're really going down the rabbit hole, the longer term future. And even when we get lost in the past, sometimes it feels like an attempt to a certain extent, bless it into comfort, And so in saying that mindfulness is being willing to die, it's pointing towards the idea that the mind's natural tendency is to kind of perpetually hedge for comfort, to perpetually hedge for safety. It's on the defense for what we don't know is coming, but we better be ready for it. And I was having a conversation with him a few months ago, but it's happened a couple of times, and we talked about the moments when we really know that identity and selfhood is arising. Of course, like we're contending with self all the time, right? But it can be subtle. But there are moments in our life when it's obvious that I am protecting myself, I am protecting my identity. And it comes along with a very strong sense of defensiveness. And so that sometimes when I think of identities that I hold, and when it arises and when they arise, I tend to only think of them in terms of moments when I felt the identity was challenged. So from the Madhyama Agama, the Buddha says, if there's one notion of identity, there is birth, there is old age, there is disease, and there is death. That which is nirvana without remainder, that is called the deathless. And of course, the Buddha is not suggesting here that the body doesn't die, that things don't change, that things don't come to an end. As we know, that is quite the opposite of the teaching, right? And so how might this idea of mindfulness as the willingness to die in deathlessness, and this idea of mindfulness as maybe defenselessness, how might that all be related? So some of us may have heard this term Sakyaditi, and it's typically translated as personality view or identity view. And it points towards this notion that we tend to look at our physical form and mental formations, what we sometimes just call the five aggregates of form, feeling, perception, intentions, or thoughts, or formations. Sometimes they're translated all sorts of different ways in consciousness, but we tend to look towards those things, one or all of them together, as some part of an enduring self. That we tend to look to those things as an essence. And I think most importantly, kind of built into this idea of view, is that we believe that. And we believe that we have an identity that is enduring. Even if we intellectually can kind of pick apart all notions of selfhood with our Dharma studies and whatnot, there's still like sometimes the tendency to operate as if we believe these things, even if we intellectually may understand them to be otherwise. And personality view is one of the earlier fetters to be broken on the path to awakening. The view around identity, not necessarily the clinging to identity, by the way, which we'll address a little bit later. And when one breaks through something like identity view, this isn't pointing towards the idea of personality disappearing or identity disappearing. We are again pointing towards progress, towards maybe holding identity and personality just a little bit lighter. And so identity shows up in so many different ways in our life, right? It shows up as roles. I'm a husband, I'm a friend, I'm a student, I'm an employee, I'm an employer, I'm a boss, I'm an apprentice. Like there's all these different roles that we play in life, and we kind of, in certain circumstances, we put our little hat on. We're like, all right, I'm Uncle Matt today. All right, I'm an electrician Matt right now. You know, like we play these different roles and then often put them down. But we also have identities around, ways of belonging. And I kind of got a little curious about this word belonging, because we so often think about it in terms of, like belonging to a group, the sense of belonging. But belonging, of course, implies ownership of some sort, you know? And so we can have identities around things that we own. Like I have a truck, I'm a Toyota guy, I'm a homeowner, things like that. But we also, of course, have these sense of belonging around groups that we may want or identify as owning us, as being part of a group. So we have identities around race or gender or sexuality or political views, or I'm a Buddhist. All sorts of different identities we might carry around that relate to belonging. And these aren't necessarily unhealthy, they're just things that are there. And then there's identities that are often probably really subtle. We don't really realize we have them. Like, I think I'm a good person. Like, that's an identity. Like, I don't know I'm not good at the banjo. I tried it and I suck. You know, like that might be an identity too, you know? And so this is from Bhikkhu Analayo. Not all identities feel so important. It might be very important to someone that they are a skilled writer or a loving sibling or a hard worker, but fairly unimportant to them that they're a good guitar player. Even if they believe all these things about themselves, they might take it completely in stride if they find that their guitar playing is actually substandard, but might become really upset if they find out that their coworkers think them lazy. Were they to become defensive about guitar skills, this might be a clue that guitar skills were actually more important to them than they may have realized. And so this points towards this idea that we may have lots of different identities that in versions of self or selves that we're kind of like somewhere in the background carrying around with us, and we don't necessarily recognize them until they're challenged. Like I didn't know I thought of myself as a hard worker until somebody told me I wasn't, right? I never really, I didn't consider myself as that being part of my identity, but then someone says something otherwise. I'm like, oh man, I've got to correct that opinion of yours. So all these defensive strategies start to arise. And thus, in a way, because defensiveness and selfiness have a tendency to arise together, you could start to think of self itself as the bulwark against discomfort. The sense of identity as being stable, and then clinging to the stability of that sense of identity as being a bulwark against discomfort and new information. So what is this defensiveness? Like, and how might it be useful for practice? You know, as I think most of us have some identity around Dharmic practice, Buddhist practice, we're here, right? And so this notion of defensiveness and selfhood, it would be easy to see the arising of defensiveness as something problematic, right? Like it's a bad thing to have happen. Of course, that would just feed into a different kind of worry, which really in a way is a self, that I'm a bad Buddhist. Like that is to a certain extent some like subtle anti-identity that might be kind of like tucked away somewhere in there. But what if we begin to see this defensiveness as a location through which to deconstruct the sense of self? So as I mentioned, this defensiveness, it seems like it arises often when there's a challenge to identity. And if you're familiar with Aristotelian logic and like kind of the notion of identity, you know, A equals A, B equals A, C equals A, therefore B equals C, like it implies like absolute stability. It revolves around the notion of constancy. And we call it an ID for a reason, like that is you. And it's you as long as you have that ID and that driver's license number. It stays the same, the number doesn't change. And of course, as we know, part of the Buddha's teaching is this notion of inconstancy, right, of anicca. And thus the notion of identity and its stability is unto itself, in Buddhist terms, delusional, because it depends upon a certain degree of constancy and essence. So the philosophers Audrey Yap and Jonathan Ichikawa say sometimes there are things we feel like we need not to know about ourselves in order to maintain our self-concept. Sometimes having a stable self-understanding can actually require us to be ignorant, either about some facts about ourselves or some fact about the world around us. And this points to the idea that defensive strategies, built within defensive strategies, lies perhaps an unconscious imperative towards maintaining ignorance. What Audrey Yap and Jonathan Ichikawa would call active ignorance. There's what we'll call inactive ignorance, which is like, oh, I just don't know. And then there we have this active ignorance, which they say is, quote, an ignorance that is maintained to protect oneself from potentially disruptive knowledge. Our main interest in active ignorance lies not in not needing to know, but in needing to not know. It lies not in not needing to know, but in needing to not know. So in Buddhist terms, defensiveness then is the dukkha that arises when the sense of self is challenged. To a certain extent, the dukkha itself is the mind's attempt to protect us from the inherently inconstant nature of new information. And what is anicca? What is impermanence? What is inconstancy if it isn't the continuous, perpetual, and typically unwelcome arising of new information? New information about ourselves, new information about the world. Discomfort in the present moment always comes with the unpredictability of new information. So long as things remain predictable and stable, we're okay with it. And thus, clinging to self really is just a bulwark against new information and an assent to ignorance. It's what the philosopher Charles Mills might call an ignorance that resists. The identity can be an ignorance that resists. Now, if I'm going anywhere with any of this, it's built in, it's coming up. And I'm going to call it the self-defeating paradox of defensiveness. And this is where I landed with my meanderings here. I'll use the I'm a hard worker identity as an example. So if I consider myself a hard worker and I keep having people in my environment tell me, maybe not, that was kind of shoddy work or something like that. But I keep either defending myself against it, ignoring the information, having justification, rationalization, all the different strategies that we might employ to prevent that new information from becoming part of like an augmented identity. Then that means the longer that I don't listen to the information, the further from the truth my identity about being a hard worker becomes. And thus this means that as information continues to pile up, that's contrary to our coagulated sense of identity around it, and as information is ignored in order to avoid the cognitive dissonance that comes along with challenges to identity, the ideal regarding that identity becomes further and further from reality the longer it is clung to. Thus, the identities that we cling to, the identities that we defend, become progressively more delusional. And that sounds like bad news. It means that the longer we hold an identity, if we have an identity that we're carrying around from like childhood or teenage years or earlier life, the longer we're holding on to that still, the more likely it is we're suffering as a direct result. The more likely it is that we have a skewed view of ourselves and reality. And as I mentioned earlier, the Buddha tells us this identity view is rooted in identification with the aggregates, in the material form, the feelings, the perception, the mental formations, and consciousness. From the Anattalakkhana Sutta, the Buddha says, seeing this, a learned disciple grows disillusioned with form, with feeling, with perception, mental formations, and consciousness. Being disillusioned, desire fades away. When desire fades away, they're freed. And when they're freed, they know they're freed. My attention kind of hones in on that word disillusioned. Nibbida, sometimes translated as disenchanted, can be thought of as kind of like the wariness about something. And so the path towards awakening involves a certain degree of disenchantment, disillusionment with the way that we form identity around the aggregates of experience. And if we want to stick with the disenchanted way of translating the word, the path towards awakening is a path of increasingly becoming less under the spell of ourselves. Progressively becoming more wary about identity becomes tiresome. defending identity becomes tiresome. And again, the Buddha isn't suggesting that forms or feelings or perceptions or consciousness or any of the other aggregates disappear. And he's not even suggesting that we don't have identities of some sort. But he is suggesting that they no longer hold a spell over us. Now, I heard Gill say once, and I don't know if he was quoting himself or if he was quoting somebody else. He said, identity is a gift that must be unwrapped. And unwrapped there, of course, would be, I suppose, Gill's version of disillusionment, disenchantment. And in practice, I like to kind of refer to it as deconstruction. So the question then is how do we unwrap this thing? How do we unwrap this thing that, essentially has caused me suffering my entire life, All of the instructions we've gotten since the very beginning have pointed in this direction. Even if we didn't realize it at the time, even if we thought, what is this silly introductory mindfulness instruction? So, the early instruction, put your mind on an object, call it the breath. And when the mind wanders, non-judgmentally come back to it. This might seem like a pretty basic instruction, right? But the non-judgmentally bringing the mind back over and over again eventually yields the realization that my mind doesn't do what I ask it to. And because my mind doesn't do what I ask it to, it becomes increasingly easier to take it less seriously. How do I identify with something that is, in many ways, seems to be out of control? Certainly not in my control. My willpower isn't doing it. And of course, taking the mind less seriously is the first step towards diminishing our need to defend it. And so you could argue that the basic instruction for mindfulness practice is pointed towards kind of the nascent working with identity and selfhood, but it has to begin with not taking it seriously. But there are practices that are squarely aimed at identity, squarely aimed at selfhood. What might those look like? So Ajahn Sumedho, he has a practice he described that he calls deliberate thinking. And this doesn't sound like the typical thing a meditation teacher is going to ask you to do. Let's do some deliberate thinking, right? And it essentially involves what you could think of as some contemplation ahead of sitting. It doesn't have to be long rabbit hole style contemplation, but it could be something along the lines of find, a narrative about selfhood that you can kind of put into a very short sentence. And the example he often uses, because it's a relatively simple and obvious one, is that when you sit down to meditate, there's probably a narrative somewhere inside that says, I'm an unenlightened being. And the whole sentence might be something like, I'm an unenlightened being, and I'm doing this because I want to become one, right? That might be the grander narrative, but I'm an unenlightened being is enough. And so the practice of deliberate thinking is to actually establish mindfulness, to establish sampajana, which is this notion of a clear comprehension, this notion of not perception, but apperception, kind of like meta-awareness of thoughts as they're arising. To establish both this sati and sampajana, and then allow the mind to utter softly to itself that narrative. I'm a good worker. Something like that, right? And the invitation with this practice is to bring particular attention to the space immediately before saying I. And to watch the way the mind responds or reacts or contracts or expands throughout the recitation of that thought, and then in the space at the conclusion of it and afterwards. And the suggestion is to look for moments when you might notice self arising and dissipating, self-contracting and expanding? How might the very thought, the very narrative, the stories we tell about ourselves be the very thing that creates the self? How might that not be the magic spell that we're casting? And of course, that sounds like a more formal practice, and these things can happen off the cushion as well. As many of you know, I'm in recovery, and there's like a, I don't know if you know, it might be part of the pop psychology like element of the recovery world, but there's this acronym called RID, RID, which you need to get rid of, right? And it stands for restlessness, irritability, and discontent. And the instruction with this practice in recovery is that whenever we notice restlessness, irritability, or discontent arise, we're supposed to see that as a moment to reflect on essentially, how am I getting in my own way here? In what way is my will trying to bulldoze through experience? And another way they ask us to reflect is to essentially say, how am I not in acceptance of what's happening here? That whenever these three things arise, how might I not be in acceptance? And I feel like RID right there can be just shortened to defensiveness, but it can also be shortened to just dukkha, right? Like however you want to look at this. I think it translates really well into Buddhist practice. And so you can think of this defensiveness as the dukkha that comes along with rubbing, the friction that comes with rubbing up against uncomfortable information, the friction with inconstancy. And if we can remember that this dukkha and this defensiveness and restlessness, irritability, discontent all arise to a certain extent when change is making itself known to the mind, how might we actually just reframe defensiveness as if it were a meditation bell? You know, I've had practice in my life where I told myself that the notification sound on my phone would be a moment to become mindful. So rather than it being the thing that I need to use to slip off into mindlessness, how might my phone going off be a meditation bell? And so the goal with the practice here would be to use defensiveness in the same way. Now, in the past, with practice, I would often see defensiveness or fear or anxiety and things like that arise, and I would typically kind of drop into the body. That would usually be my way of navigating it. Typically an elements practice, something like that. And that is a good way to establish presence and to regulate the nervous system if I'm kind of getting out of control and lost in identity and whatnot. But I think we can add to that. I think we can add to that this notion of deliberate thinking in day-to-day life. And we can inquire into what narrative might be arising when the defensiveness arises. So as we feel contraction around experience, what story is coming up? What's the narrative? What's the identity? Matt, that's shoddy work, somebody said. And of course, the narrative that comes up is, but I'm a hard worker. And then it goes into, I'm a good worker. I'm just like my grandpa. Like that's what starts to come up for me. Like all these kind of like nested identities. And so thus we can start to see that the degree of defensiveness we feel is directly proportional to the degree of clinging we have about it. And that's some insight right there. Now, we might not always be able to like drop in and do deliberate thinking. You know, like let's say I'm at work and somebody says, hey, that's shoddy work. It might not be the moment to go, can you hold on a moment? I'm going to go sit over here and deconstruct this on the scissor lift. Like that's not what's going to happen, right? So that might not be the moment for deliberate thinking, but there is typically enough space to at least inquire into what the narrative might be, to inquire into who is showing up right now and what's he got to say. And it would be useful to hold a journal. It would be useful to write these narratives down and maybe don't even touch them for a while. Do it for 60 or 90 days and then see what the pattern is. It's like, who are these people? This could be fun. At least it strikes me as fun. So there can be these formal practices with narratives. There can be informal practice with these narratives around defensiveness. And if I haven't said it enough, I'm going to say it again. And to go back to Gil's statement about identity being a gift to be unwrapped, that means we don't throw it away. We don't open gifts and throw them away. So even if whatever we find about our identity doesn't mean like, okay, now that I've realized that that's me for whatever reason identifying with my grandpa, that doesn't mean like I can't keep that identity to such an extent that it's part of my personality. You don't throw something like that away. And in a way, like a strong sense of self is kind of important for healthy psychological functioning. So we do need to recognize these identities that we live with and that we work with. But do we have to cling to them? Do we have to defend them? Do we have to resist new information? Do these identities have to remain the same over time? Can I get a more nuanced view of what type of work I do, despite the fact that it's remained relatively static since I was 12 or something? Maybe it's time to update the information. And so, of course, practice then is aimed at the opposite of defensiveness. It's aimed at openness. It's aimed at receptivity, a willingness to meet new information, to meet inconstancy, to meet challenges. And my hope is that maybe some of us feel inspired to meet defensiveness even with open arms and with an open heart. So I offer this as for your consideration, and thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing from you.